Welcome and thank you for joining our webinar today, 8-Step Guide to Administering Windows Without Domain Admin Privileges, featuring our guest speaker today, IT and Windows security expert Russell Smith. You're also joined by BeyondTrust product manager Jason Silva, who will run us through a brief overview of BeyondTrust product, PowerBroker for Windows, after Russell's portion, so please stick around for that. My name is Sarah, your webinar host today, and a kind reminder to please submit your questions via the GoToMeeting console anytime throughout the webinar, and we will cover your questions at the end during our Q&A time. So anytime you have a question, just pop it on in, and I'm going to be monitoring those throughout the webinar. Also, today's session is being recorded. You will receive a follow-up email containing links to the recording and the slides shown here today within 1 to 2 business days from now. It will come from communications@beyondtrust.com, so be on the lookout for that follow-up. The slides can also be immediately downloaded via the handout section in the GoToWebinar console. You should find that on the right side of your screen in the handout section. So at this point, let's hand it on over to Russell, who will jump right in. Hello, Russell. Welcome. Take it away.
Thanks, Sarah.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Sarah, for the introduction, and welcome everybody to today's session on administering Windows without domain admin privileges. Before I get started, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. In addition to working for BeyondTrust in these webinars, I'm also working for some other sites, so you can find some interesting articles by me over at the Petri IT Knowledge Base. I'm a regular blogger there. If you're particularly interested in Windows security, there's lots of articles by me over at the Windows IT Pro website, and I've also got a couple of Azure courses live now over at Pluralsight. And of course, don't forget, if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, you can see my Twitter handle there in the bottom right hand corner. But I also have a book out at the moment which is dedicated to the subject of least privilege security. And this book contains a lot of advice on not only the technical aspects of implementing a least privilege project in your organization, but also about the political challenges that you might face with any such project. So you can head over to the Pact Publishing website, and I think there's actually a pretty good discount on that book there at the moment. Okay, so before I get into the main part of my presentation today, I want to ask you all a quick question. So do you issue IT staff with domain admin privileges? So do you add them to the domain admin privileges group? So if you have a look over on the GoToMeeting panel, you'll see a little hands up icon, and if you do, I would like you to just raise your hands. Don't be shy. So I'll just give you a couple of seconds to do this, just to get an idea of what the general situation is. Okay, so I can see a couple of hands going up there. Okay, that's great. Okay, thank you very much. So when I started out in IT as a junior Windows administrator, one of the first things that I was asked to do when I started the job, I got there on my first day at 9 o'clock in the morning, and I'd already been granted domain admin privileges by the IT manager, so I had access to all of the company's systems, even though this was my first day. And the only way that this company could really trust me was from their perceptions of me at interview. But nevertheless, they decided to give me domain admin privileges, and well, you know, for me that's quite an unusual thing to do when you don't really even know this person and you're giving them access to basically your entire company's systems. But on the first day at this new job, I was asked by one of the senior salesmen to open up an email on the Exchange server and delete it from the CEO's inbox. Now, this is a very interesting situation, and there are probably some ethical questions about whether he should be asking me to do that and whether I should be fulfilling his request. But as a young junior administrator, I wanted to, you know, have a good day on my first job and not make enemies. And this was a senior sales guy. And okay, so I opened up Exchange, he showed me which email he wanted me to delete, and I deleted it. And the reason he explained to me was that they were arranging a surprise party for the CEO. If I remember correctly, it was a birthday party. And somebody had accidentally sent some information about the party to the CEO, ruining the surprise. And before he gets into the office, can I please delete it? So, looking back on that, I was probably rather naive to go along with that. But later in the day, I had a look at that information again. Of course, information which I probably shouldn't have access to as a junior sysadmin. And I noticed that the contents of the email was not about a surprise birthday party, but about actually somebody who complained about this guy and sent an email directly to the CEO. So it was very clear why he wanted me to delete that information. Now you can argue, well, okay, that's not something disastrous, not going to endanger the company, but it does go to show what information and power you have as a domain administrator, and it's probably not something you want to hand out randomly to your IT staff. Now, nothing very bad came of that situation, apart from me feeling rather gullible afterwards. And maybe, I don't know, people have been in similar situations where they've had inappropriate requests to do this or to do that. But the real danger of handing out domain admin rights is that privileged access to Active Directory significantly increases the risk of your systems being compromised. And there are many different ways, of course, in which systems become compromised. So let's have a look at them. So of course, most of these will probably be already familiar to you, but probably the most interesting one that I want to call out on the slide is pass the hash. Because this is one of the most common ways that systems become infected or compromised. So what is pass the hash? Well, this gives a hacker who has local administrative access to a device, enables them to be able to log on with an account without them actually having access to the account's password. So we often think that in order to get hold of, for instance, domain admin privileges, the password itself needs to become compromised. Well, that's actually not true. All we need to do is find a machine where somebody has logged on, let's say with domain admin privileges, and if we've also got local admin privileges to that device, there's a fairly good chance that we'll be able to use that token or hash and use those credentials to log on to a sensitive system like a domain controller. And once that's happened, it's game over. You have basically lost the game, and you can consider not only Active Directory compromise, but all of the systems that are joined to that domain. And you might not even notice that that has happened. Of course, there are lots of other things that can happen, and other ways to compromise systems that you can see on the screen there. Privilege abuse I put at the bottom there, and that was kind of connected to the story that I introduced this presentation with. Of course, it could have been much more serious in terms of data leakage. I could have been a bad guy and wanting to steal particular pieces of information that also having domain admin privileges gives your system administrators. So these are the risks. So why do we tend to give out domain admin privileges to IT staff? Well, there are lots of reasons why we think we need to do it. But actually, you don't really need those kinds of privileges to Active Directory to do most of your everyday IT sysadmin stuff. So for instance, everyday management of Active Directory itself doesn't require any privileged access to the directory. Supporting user workstations. Well, the easiest way to give your IT staff remote access and administrator access to those workstations is, boom, make them a domain administrator. Problem solved. You don't need to do that. And I'll show you how to get around that later in the presentation. Things like using PowerShell remoting. You don't need to be an administrator or a domain administrator to use PowerShell remoting or to manage member servers that are joined to your domain. But these are all frequently cited as reasons as to why I need domain administrator privileges. If your domain is properly designed and thought out, you don't need any of those things. So how can we do these things that you can see on the screen here? How can we do them without domain administrator privileges? So I'm going to give you 8 tips that will help you to remove privileged access from your IT staff. So let's start with the first. So, separation of administration. Now you may have heard about this. And what do I mean exactly? Well, let's give an example. Imagine you've got a small business and they only have one server. And on that server, they have to have, of course, everything. So the server is primarily installed as a domain controller. But then on top of that, of course, we need to have things like DNS, DHCP. Okay, maybe that's not the end of the world. But then we need everything else on top of that as well. We need there maybe to have Exchange and the file server and whatever else that business requires. The problem with this solution is that if everything is installed on this one physical operating system, it becomes very difficult to administer securely, especially from the aspect of the domain controller. So we need to split out those roles. Now, of course, in the past, this used to be much more difficult and more expensive to do because we'd need a separate physical box for every role if we wanted separation of administration. So if I want to give rights to my DC separately from DHCP, well, then I need to put them on 2 physical boxes, separate physical boxes. But with the advent of virtualization, of course, we don't necessarily need to do that, although we do need to worry about maybe Windows Server licensing costs. But the more you can separate out the roles, the easier it becomes to secure your environment, especially when we're talking about domain controllers. So in an ideal world, the domain controller should be just a DC, and it shouldn't perform any other role if possible. So this is what I mean by separation of administration. And as you start to look into removing domain admin privileges from your IT staff, you'll begin to appreciate why it's easier to separate out the roles as I'm showing you in this slide. So this is a basic principle which will help you move forwards with removing domain admin rights. Now, right at the beginning, I mentioned my book, Least Privileged Security. So I'm guessing that probably most of you on this call understand the concept of least privileged security. So basically, it means you only give users the rights and privileges they need in order to complete a specific task or a set of tasks that are related to their job. And this is a fundamental security principle. Which is mainly ignored, of course. But it's very important to ensure that we have a minimal attack surface exposed, and it reduces the risk of breach, of course. So, but what do we have going on in most organizations? So I don't know if your organization is like this, but if I go into a company, it's very often the case that there are lots of user accounts in the domain admins group. Now, of course, domain admins isn't the only privileged AD groups. These are the 3 that you can see on the slide here. These are the 3 main privileged groups in Active Directory, but they're also not the only ones. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the problem is that there are so many user accounts in these groups that it really exposes your Active Directory to any kind of change at any time, whether it be on purpose, accidentally, by a malicious user. You can't really have any control over your environment if these groups are populated. So the advice, and it's also Microsoft's best practice advice, is that privileged AD groups, especially these three, but actually all of them, should be empty most of the time. Yes, so I'll say that again. They should be empty most of the time, okay? And you only populate them when you need to make a change to a domain controller. So instead of looking like they do on the screen now, they should look like this, again, most of the time. So I'm guessing that probably for most of you, it's the domain admins group that is hyper-populated, possibly enterprise admins, and maybe also schema admins, but domain admins is usually the one that causes most problems. So I said that these aren't the only privileged groups in Active Directory. And privileged group, what does it mean, privileged group or privileged access to the directory? It means that these groups give permission to make fundamental changes to domain controllers. So that's what I mean. So there are some other groups, and you might be surprised at some of these groups that have privileged access to domain controllers. So you can see on the slide, I put the three main groups at the top, but there are a whole load of others as well. So you need to be aware of them. And again, most of the time, these should not be populated with user accounts. So I'm just going to pick out one there. So if you have a look at print operators, so for instance, you might have people in this group because you want them to, because you use it for giving access to administer servers, because this is a domain group. But I recommend that you don't use the print operators group for the purposes of giving access to manage print servers. But if you must use that group, for instance, print operators, then you should make sure you remove any rights that that group has on your domain controllers. But preferably just use another group and avoid using and populating these privileged groups in Active Directory. It's really important. Okay, so now we know which privileged groups we have, apart from those three main ones that probably everybody knows. There are quite a lot of privileged groups, and you need to make sure that they're very carefully managed. But how exactly do we go about doing that so that we can give access to the domain controllers when needed, and so that we can give access to Active Directory for things like user management, resetting passwords, populating groups, this kind of thing. How do we do that without domain admin privileges? So on the screen, you can see the three, what I call the three main privileged groups in Active Directory. And it is these groups that I recommend you give, that you use for giving privileged access to domain controllers when it's needed. So, of course, there are times when you will need to give your users that kind of access to a DC for whatever reason. And why these three particular groups and not any of the others? Because these groups, first of all, they give a lot of access that you might require to do something in particular. And these are the only three groups that can be moved into a custom OU. So what I have here are these three privileged groups. I have a custom OU, and you can see at the bottom of the slide I have some users. And these are what I call directory service management accounts. And they will have control of the groups inside this custom OU. So let me explain what I mean. So these three privileged groups, you can see on the next slide, they will be put into this custom OU, and the directory service management accounts that you can see at the bottom of the slide, they will have specific permission on this custom OU to populate these three privilege groups: domain admins, enterprise, and schema admins. And that is their only function of the directory service management accounts. They can't do anything else. They can just add and remove users from these three privileged groups, and that is it. And that is their purpose. So you're thinking, okay, well, so why? Why do that? Because it puts in a process where we control who is a member of these three main privilege groups, and we use a manual business process to control the password access to the directory service management accounts. Yeah, and then user named accounts like mine, for instance. Let's say I'm a sysadmin at this company, Russell Smith. So the directory service management account will add my named user account into the domain admins group when I require that access to DCs, and then the same DS management account will remove my Active Directory named user account from the domain admins group once I no longer require that access, once my, for instance, change request has finished. So this gives you a level of control over named accounts that have this high level of privileged access to Active Directory and domain controllers. Of course, this is not an ideal solution. A privileged access management solution, a third-party solution, would help you manage this maybe more efficiently. But if you don't have that kind of solution, then a manual business process to control access to the DS management accounts can help you protect your Active Directory. So that's one way you can control access, privileged access to domain controllers and Active Directory. But what about your help desk staff who want to, for instance, reset passwords or create user accounts and do this kind of thing? So on the screen here, you can see a screenshot of the Active Directory Users and Computers tool, which I'm sure that probably most of you are familiar with. And again, with a carefully designed organizational unit structure, you can grant Active Directory users permission to do specific things on containers and organizational units, OUs. So you can see in the screenshot here that I'm using a tool called the Delegation of Control Wizard to specify that on the user accounts OU, which is something that I've created, I want to give a particular group, Active Directory group or user, for instance, permission to do some common tasks. So create, delete, and manage user accounts being one of them. And there's a whole list of common tasks already created within the wizard to make it easy for you to grant those particular permissions. So now your help desk staff, they don't need domain admin privileges to create a user account in AD. They can do it, at least in this OU, not any other OU, of course. They can do it just logging on with their standard user account. They don't need any special permissions to Active Directory in order to do daily management tasks. So you can see here, again, the Active Directory Users and Computers tool. Again, that's something that they would use from their own device. So they don't need to log on to a domain controller to access that tool. That's also an important point. So they are now able to do this from their own device, and they don't need domain admin privileges. You can get the Active Directory Users and Computers tool on Windows 7 or Windows 8 by installing the Remote Server Administration tools, and you can just download them and install them on your IT people's workstations. Okay, so that's about how to manage privileged access and just normal access, let's say, to Active Directory. But what about managing access to end user devices? So why do we give domain admin privileges to do this? Two reasons. Well, the first is the technicalities of it. the domain admins group is a member of the local administrators group on every member server and every domain joined device. So if we give our IT staff domain admin privileges, it automatically gives them the access they need to log on with administrative privileges to workstations and member servers and to do remote desktop session to those devices. Problem solved. But you don't need, again, to give them domain admin privileges, and in fact, of course, you shouldn't. So on the screen here, you can see a screenshot of the group policy editor, and I have opened up there group policy preferences. And with group policy preferences, you can add or update, or maybe better to say manipulate group membership. So why not create a group in Active Directory? I've called mine here Workstation Admins, and add that group instead to the local administrators group on every workstation, and add your IT staff to the Workstation Admins group. Now this, of course, will give them remote desktop and administrator access to all of your workstations without them needing domain admin access. Group policy preferences is probably the best way to manage group membership on all of your devices, but it's not the only way. There's also restricted groups policy, which kind of stamps group membership on local groups, so you need to be a little bit careful with it. But they're both tools that you can use in group policy to help you give admins the kind of access they need to workstations without domain admin rights. Or, for instance, you could just make them a member of the remote desktop users group without giving them administrative rights to the workstation. Or you can do both, or either or, whatever you decide to do and you think is best. So managing privileged accessed servers. So here, of course, I'm talking about servers that are joined to your domain. So the first thing is that you need to make sure you're managing the local administrator accounts on all of your member servers. And I recommend that you use the local administrator password solution. It's a free download from Microsoft. And basically what this does is it randomizes the password on every device. It can also be used for workstations, and then it stores the local administrator password for each server, each device, securely in Active Directory. And it's important that you have a unique password on every device, because you don't want to have the same password on each device. If somebody does discover that password, then you've lost your entire server estate. And this is what this tool is for. So I really recommend you have a look at that. And that is the first step to sorting out privileged access to your servers. But what about granting access, administrative access to those servers? Again, it's preferable to use an Active Directory named account to do that. It's not the only way to do it, but it's usually my preference. And you can see at the top of the slide, I've got my Active Directory accounts, my IT people, and in Active Directory, I'm going to create a group for each server. And in the next slide, that will all come together, and you'll see that I've added the group for each server, so AD group server 1, so it's a group in AD, and I'm going to add that group to the built-in administrators group on the server. So when I need to give administrative access to that server, all I need to do is add the AD user into the AD group server 1, and hey presto, he's got admin access to that server until I remove him. And again, you can use delegation of control and organizational units to control who is able to populate these groups. And you might decide to allow, I don't know, anybody to do it, probably not a good idea. Or you might decide to have some restrictions. It doesn't necessarily have to be as strictly controlled as access to domain controllers, but probably it needs to be fairly strictly controlled. But what mechanism you use to do that, I think you get the idea from the previous tip about how you might achieve that with OUs and controlling who has access to populate these groups. Okay, so okay, well, you know, we have this idea of giving people named accounts privileged access to the domain or to member servers or to workstations, but there's always the argument that, well, so-and-so, he or she needs to perform a regular task every day. I don't know, they need to restart a service, or they need to do this, or they need to do that, and we don't want to have to go through this process of requesting administrative access to that server every time this thing happens. And there are a couple of ways you can solve that. You could give that user permanent permission to do something on the server, but you should be very careful doing that. If you decide to do that, be very careful that you don't inadvertently give you know, privileged access to something on a permanent basis, which could cause a problem in the future. That is one option. Another option is to use PowerShell JEA, or Just Enough Administration, and this works with the help of PowerShell remoting. So don't be scared if you don't use PowerShell or if you don't know anything about it. I'm not going to try and teach you any PowerShell in this particular session, but just to give you the idea of how it works and how you might use it to perform a simple task that needs to be performed every day. Now, one of the problems with PowerShell remoting is that people think that in order to use it, you need to have administrator access to the server that you're connecting to. And that isn't really true. The default connection endpoint, and PowerShell remoting is enabled by default in Windows Server 2012 and later. Anything before that, you'll have to manually enable it. But the default endpoint, yes, it does require that you have administrator access in order that you can do anything. And that default remoting endpoint, it gives you access to do everything. You know, as long as you've got administrator access on that box, then you can use any commandlet you like, any PowerShell module. Functions are not restricted in any way. You can do exactly what you want. But it doesn't have to be like that. So you can create your own endpoints, and you can restrict what they do and how and who, rather better to say who, I guess, who can access them. So this is called constrained endpoints. So you can set up constrained endpoints on your server. So you can give users access, named user accounts access, and they don't have to be a member of the administrators group. So you could give them, for instance, permission to restart a service or to shut down the machine. They don't have to be a local administrator to do that. You can decide what privileges that user needs in order to connect. And on top of that, you can restrict their access even further by saying, well, okay, users who connect to this endpoint can only run this commandlet or a set of commandlets. Maybe they only have set to a specific set of modules, and you can limit what functions they can run, and you can really restrict what access that person has. Now that is connecting in what I would call the mode where whatever user account they connect to the remote server with, they have the same rights as the user account has on that box. Okay, but you can restrict it down, as I said before, like just one commandlet they can run or one module or whatever. But there's also another way that you can connect using a PowerShell remoting, and you can use what's called a per session JEA account. And what this is that when the user connects to the remote endpoints, instead of using their own account, an account is created that has local administrator privilege to that box. But, and here's the important but, the user connecting to the remote server never needs to know the username and password for that account. Okay, but they get administrator access for that session. And of course, you can also add limitations and say, well, okay, I want to give people who are allowed to connect to that remote endpoint, I want to give them administrator access on the box, but I'm going to limit what they can do with that permission. So I just want them to be able to run this commandlet or these commandlets and these modules and nothing else. So there's also something that you could consider for this kind of ad hoc administration that needs to happen outside of the usual business process for granting privileged access. Okay, so what about some best practices in terms of managing the domain and making privileged changes to the domain? Well, there's a couple of points here that I'd like to make. So I mentioned before kind of a manual process and using directory service management accounts to control who can populate domain, enterprise and schema admins. But if you're a much bigger organization and you have the resources, of course a privileged access management system can automate that workflow for you, and of course it scales much more easily than the manual process that I described, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. Tiered administration is a little bit complicated, but what I just want to brush on it briefly here is that whenever you make privilege changes to a domain controller or to the domain, you want to perform those changes from a device that is secured specially for accessing a domain controller. You shouldn't be doing it from any old machine on your network. So you should have a tier of devices that are secured to the same standard as your domain controllers in order that you can manage them securely. And those devices are called privileged access workstations. So a little bit about privileged access management. Now Microsoft has its own system which relies on several technologies in Windows Server 2016, such as just-in-time administration, which is a PowerShell technology, a little bit different from just-enough administration, and shadow groups and various other bits and pieces there in Windows Server 2016. Let's get the year right. So how does it work? Well, it works by you adding an extra domain to your forest, a bastion domain, which you will use to control access to your production domains. So the first thing that you do is you identify groups in your production domain that have access to valuable resources. So you can see on the screen here that there's a group called HR admins that has access to the HR database in the production system. Now, what we do is we remove any user accounts we have in the HR admins group in the production domain, and we create a shadow principal of that group in the bastion domain. And that is what the bastion domain is for, and we add shadow principals to that domain. And when we want any user to have access to the HR database in the production domain, we use some kind of workflow. So in this example, it's Microsoft Identity Manager to add the shadow principal for the user account in the production domain to the shadow group of the production group in our bastion forest. And then that gives the user, in this case Jen, it will give her access to the HR database. But we didn't touch anything in the production domain itself. Everything was controlled like a puppet on a string, if you like, through our bastion domain. Now the reason Microsoft have implemented the solution like this is because they are compromised. is compromised, and the only way we can truly secure it is by using the system of shadow control through a bastion domain that is completely newly deployed, and we can secure it and be sure that it's secure and that it stays secure. Of course, nobody wants to replace their production domain. This is a huge task. So this is the best next thing to actually starting your production domain again from scratch. Now, it's quite a complicated solution. As you can see, it's got lots of moving parts. It's definitely not for the faint-hearted, and you have to license Microsoft Identity Manager separately, but it's something you could think about if you wanted that extra workflow if you are a relatively big organization. Okay, so that's privileged access management. What about privileged access workstations? Well, here you can see tier 0. This is the tier where all of my devices are secure to the same level as my domain controllers. So the only reason that I would log on to a privileged access workstation is if I need to make a privilege change to the domain or to a domain controller. No other reason. That is what these workstations are used for. How would I do that? I would use the remote server administration tools on the privileged access workstation. So nobody should be logging on directly to a domain controller to make any kind of changes. That should happen on these specially configured and isolated workstations. What about other management things that need to happen on domain controllers? Not just domain controllers, but if we don't have that kind of direct physical access to them, how do we make all those things happen? Well, things that you should definitely do is, of course, you should make sure you have Windows Server update services working. You don't need to log on to those devices, those domain controllers, to manually patch them. And you should make sure that you're pulling out the event logs as well and centralizing them somewhere from your domain controllers so that they're easily accessible and readable whenever you need them. So here you can see again that we've got a Windows Server update server dedicated for the job of updating your domain controllers because it has control over the DC, so it should be also put into the same tier and secure to the same standard as your domain controllers. And those updates can then happen without you having to worry too much about security. And of course, you can use Windows event forwarding to centralize all of the event logs from your domain controllers so that they're available in one place. Of course, there are other ways to access the event logs. You can use the remote server administrator tools and connect from a privileged access workstation to your domain controllers to view those logs for each server separately. That's really a difficult way to manage the event logs, and better to have them all collected somewhere using built-in technology into Windows Server, Windows Event Forwarding, and that's pretty easy to set up. Okay, so those are my 8 tips for how to manage Windows without domain admin privileges. I hope that's given you some ideas about how you might implement that in your organization. But now I'm going to hand over to Beyond Trust.
All right, thank you very much, Russell. All right, let me just start up. I have a couple of slides just kind of touch on a little bit. Got a little bit of time left here. So all of those tips are absolutely wonderful, right? And every time somebody asks, we do things with security as well, every time somebody asks, if Microsoft has all of these things, you know, why do I still need you? I find oftentimes that what breaks down security and the use of it is the operational aspect. If it's too difficult to set up, if it's too difficult to maintain, if it's too difficult for the user, the actual stakeholder that needs to do something, to actually go through those steps, they're not going to, right? They're going to find a way, they're going to complain. So what we want to do is have a way that we can still secure the network, but also not really change the user's experience, you know, at least to such a degree where they just don't want to use the security things in place and don't look for workarounds to these kind of things. So Beyond Trust has a few products that sort of assist with this, whether it be the privileged access management, that idea around not exposing credentials for privileged accounts, but still allowing me as a person to use them, whether that be a remote session to a machine, whether that be just running a single application, even from my primary workstation. There are things that I want to do from there that I don't necessarily need to actually have the credentials for privileged accounts, and that's what this is about here. So we have a few products that go along this. Our focus is really going to be here around the privilege management on the Windows side today, right? But we have sort of sister products around Mac, Unix, Linux. You'll see Windows today relate that concept to the other operating systems as well. But let me get into it a little bit, right? So on this box, I'm a standard user, right? It doesn't matter I'm on a Windows 10 box, Windows 8, Windows 2016, 2008, whatever it really happens to be. So it's a Windows box. And on that Windows machine, I have processes that run. Some of these things are installers. Some of them are updaters. Some of them are flat-out applications that I just need to run as part of my job. And on this machine, Procmon, right? So if I try to run Process Monitor, well, of course, I'm not going to be able to. Keep in mind, I'm a standard user. But what if this was an application that was part of my daily routine? Well, the same thing with something as simple as data source configuration. I can't create a system data source. Well, maybe I have to. Maybe I need to go into my event log from this machine. I don't want to go to another machine just to carry this out. If I try to connect to another machine, well, it's not going to let me. I don't actually have the rights to do any of that because I don't have admin access on a remote host. If I got my usernames right, we'll do it this way. Then we'll connect to this guy. Maybe we won't. I'll get that right in a second. Either way, so I have applications that I want to run. I don't want to go through a process of going through, or from my point of view, setting up a bastion domain. I don't want to, as a user, go through every time I need to do something and go to some portal to get access to what I need to do. I just want to run the application and have it work the way that it's expected to. So here I have a few rules that are actually already set up. These ones here, the Sysinternal Suite, it's a rule that points to where Procmon is and some other Sysinternals apps. And if I run something from that folder, then I'm going to elevate the application. Now this is key. In this case, I'm not going to change who owns or who's running the application. I'm simply going to give the rights that that application needs to the application. Essentially, the app will be in the administrator security group. The user will not be touched. I don't need to make them as temporary admin. I don't need to set up just enough administration and manage that on an ongoing basis. I simply need to say, these things are okay. If I wanted just certain people to be able to run those, I could do that as well. Just a matter of popping into the rules and specifying some kind of criteria that says this is when these people get the rule and these are the people that don't. Just if you've ever used preferences, you've used item level targeting as well. Let this update in the lab. All right, so my new policy is applied. That new policy being that these two rules are now turned on. Earlier when I tried to run Process Monitor, it didn't let me. Well, now I can. And again, Process Monitor maybe isn't the most advanced tool in the world, although I do love it, or a business application that you're using there. It's just an app that needs admin rights, and I don't have them as a person. I do not want to give them to the people because even if I go through and set up these things and give somebody, certain access to certain files or certain permissions over AD, if I give them in the way that Microsoft lays out, they always have them. So if another user gets my account, if malware or something gets it, they're going to have those same rights. This way, the user doesn't actually have those rights. But when that user runs this application, and if I wanted to specify only when they run an application from a certain machine, I can do that too. That's the only time during the session of that application that these rights actually exist. But again, it's only the application that actually has them. Now, when I run applications like the tools in RSAT or Event Viewer in the purpose of remoting to another event log. That's a little bit different. The elevation that's required isn't on this box in this local host. That elevation is required someplace else, whether it be a DC or just another machine. So in that case, I'm going to do it a little bit differently. Where the rules that I have set up don't change the context of who actually runs the application, these ones do. You can see here I have a few of the Microsoft apps. Now, I'm going to use part of another product that we have, and it actually part of it comes with PowerBroker for Windows, so you can use this feature. Basically, I'm going to use credentials that are managed with our password management system called Password Safe. The user that I'm logged in as happens to have an ADM account. It doesn't have to be this way, but in my lab, that's the way it is. So if I run any of these rules, any of these applications that are underneath the Windows system task, which you can imagine what they are, a bunch of the MMC kind of things, then instead of just elevating and granting rights to the application, I am going to get credentials, play them in, and run an application as somebody else. Again, in this case, it's ADM and then the logged on user. So now with those turned on, because they were turned off a second ago, I'm just making sure that my policy is up to date. This mode that I'm using for PowerBroker for Windows does ask that I commit those changes. If I happen to be using our group policy mode, of course the changes would be live, just like group policy is. And I'm going to ask it again to go manually, get the new policy. This would happen on its own, but I don't think we want to wait that out. So now when I run something like Event Viewer, you can see right there it's pretty quick. Event Viewer isn't running as the logged on user anymore. Event Viewer is running as this user's ADM account or a shared help desk account or a shared DBA account. Whatever the situation would have called for, I can play that in to the application itself. Or if I'm running the RSAT tool, it's the same thing. If I want to run GPMC, I need to run it as a user that has certain rights. Those rights may have been a flat-out domain admin right. Those rights may have been a more targeted set of rights. But I don't want to give them to a human directly. What I'm really going after here is when people say, I need to be an admin, it's just a level of access that they require to do their job. So I'll give them just that access, though, without giving them the actual credentials. Not that I want to assume they're going to be malicious, but it could happen. But I don't want to give them the credentials to get themselves in trouble, right? The beauty here is that if you can't do it, you can't be blamed for it either, right? So let's control what can and can't be done. And PowerBroker for Windows, that's really what it's about. It's about managing that least privilege access. What is the lowest set of rights I could give to an application and still allow it to work the way it needs to? Whether it be, like I said, an application that needs to elevate at the start, like something like a process monitor. Maybe I don't need to elevate the application, but I need to let it update, like iTunes or Adobe Reader. I don't want to elevate Adobe Reader, but I certainly want to let it update if I'm not happen to managing those updates through some other mechanism, like WSUS, which would be a great idea. In a perfect world, we'd have all this laid out. But it doesn't happen that way. There's only a certain amount of time that we have to set all these things up. And even if you go through all those steps, you still got to go through and maintain, and you still may not get to the point where everything is going to be operational. Exactly. So again, so I wanted to leave a little time for some questions. I'm sure there's some after Russell's going through his part there. Real quick summary, log in as a standard user, not an admin. Make sure that everything still works. Done. All right. So I believe, Sarah, you have some questions that might have popped up?
Yes, questions and one more poll. So let me launch the poll and then we'll dive into Q&A. Here at Beyond Trust, we'd love to help you guys with your privileged access management needs. Would you like to schedule a personalized one-on-one demo with a Beyond Trust security engineer? Let us know. Select yes. somebody will be in contact with you if you do select yes, please, and to schedule that one-on-one demo, and you can walk through more of PowerBroker for Windows or any of our other PAM solutions. Okay, so let's dive on in. Russell, this came in for you. So are you saying that the admin should be using an emergency ID instead of a privileged ID?
No. So yeah, it's a little bit complicated. So if you don't have, either a solution like PowerBroker for Windows or a privileged access management solution like Microsoft are offering, then one way to manage privileged access to the domain, for instance, is to use a separate set of accounts called directory service management accounts to manage the populating and depopulating, if you like, those free privilege groups, domain, enterprise, and schema admins. And what you do when you populate those groups is you populate them with named user accounts. So as I said during the slides, that we would populate that group with the Russell Smith, my own user account, and it's me. I will get privileged access to that domain controller. It's just the controlling of those groups in terms of who is allowed to populate them and unpopulate them. It could be an unnamed directory service management account, but the actual privileged access to the server, no, that is a named user account.
This came in from Jonathan. We have engineers that state they need access to domain admin within 30 seconds. Have you seen any compromises between availability and having users in the domain admin group? And if so, what do you suggest?
Well, there are some things like the protected users group, which I think works on Windows 8 and Windows Server 2008 and later. And basically, if you have, if you're using an account that is a member of one of those privileged groups, like domain admins, for instance, it stops certain things happening when you log on to a device that isn't secure to the same level as a domain controller. For instance, it will stop your privileges from being cached on the device, which sometimes hackers use as a way to compromise a privileged account. And it does several other things. I mean, it's not much of a compromise, and it's probably not going to save you from being hacked, but it might help. But you have to, you really have to implement some solution to keep those groups empty, really. So.
Russell, if you throw DAs in local admin, you spray your token all over the place, opening risk to pass the hash. No?
Sorry, if you put DAs?
Yeah, DAs in local admin.
Domain admins.
Well, right. Okay. So domain admins and local admins. Well, that's done by default. It's a default setting. And what I was suggesting during the slides is that, first of all, you don't use domain admins to give access to the local administrators group, that you set up another group, and how you control access to that group, and you can give temporary access to that group. You don't have to have people in that group all of the time. So you can remove, reduce the risk by making sure that those groups that have access to your workstations are only populated as required, for instance. It's not a perfect solution. PowerBroker for Windows gives a much better solution to that, of course.
Jason, would PowerBroker for Windows work with Skype version? This is from Antoine. Would that work with the Skype version since it gets updated every couple of days?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it doesn't matter how often an application actually gets updated. If, I'm assuming that the application requires, elevated rights. If it doesn't, then you don't need a rule on it, unless you're trying to deny it, which you can do as well. But oftentimes I create a rule based on the signature of the application. Microsoft signed an application with a product name and a file name. If I care about the version, I can put that in too. But usually I don't put the version in. If a new version comes out, that's okay. That's not going to get in my way.
Let's see, I have another one for you, Jason. Let me grab it. So if admin rights are assigned to an app, do child processes of that app inherit those rights?
It's a checkbox. So we don't turn it on by default because you want to be careful. If you ever had to elevate something like Task Manager, which could run anything, you wouldn't necessarily want the child apps to be elevated for that. But if you had, if you needed to elevate an installer, which would certainly spawn a bunch of children, then you probably do. It's just a checkbox that says apply to the children.
Another one for you, Jason. So can PowerBroker be used to prevent developers from having admin access to their machines? Developers are constantly developing code and using multiple utilities to do their work. Whitelisting isn't possible when, for example, they have created a new script or .dll to change machine settings.
Yeah, no, I used to be a dev. I know. To a point, they're right. It's very, very difficult to, you know, hands-off lock down, say, a developer. So you have a set of rules that allow for like Visual Studio or Toad, whatever they happen to be doing, to be elevated because they'll be needed. And then they have what's called the shell rule. It's a type of rule that allows them to right-click on something and then just elevate it. There's no rule specifically made for it, but it is something that they're going to come across. So developers, even IT staff, tend to keep this shell rule forevermore. Whereas most folks, as you're implementing least privilege, they'll have it for just a little bit, just to get them over the hump that on Friday they were an admin and then Monday they're not. So yeah, absolutely, a developer does not have to log in with admin rights, but they do need, you know, more rules, you know, other rules or more access, say, than someone in finance.
Okay, time for one more question. This might be a question for both of you, but I think we'll focus on Russell answering. So shouldn't we consider as a best practice to use a separate account for privileged accesses instead of regular accounts and ensure that we do not combine privileged accessors with internet access and email accesses?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. It's possible. It's another approach, but then of course you have to manage 2 accounts for every sysadmin, so that kind of increases the work in that aspect. But it's also an approach that you could take. What I propose in the slides is definitely not the only solution to the problem. It's just my preferred solution. But yeah, it's also an option, of course.
Okay, guys, thanks for sticking around with us. I know we're a couple minutes past the top of the hour, so I want to be cognizant of your time and get you out of here. So just a reminder that we recorded this session. The slides are also available in the handout section right now, but we will be sending you a follow-up email. It will come from communications@beyondtrust.com. So make sure that that email is whitelisted so that you receive the follow-up without any interruption. And that will be sent to you within 1 to 2 business days with the links to the recording and the slides. So be on the lookout for that follow-up. Thanks, everybody, for joining today. Thanks, Russell. Thank you, Jason. We love you guys, and we appreciate everybody joining live today. We'll see you at the next one. And take care, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.